for the generous introduction, and thanks you guys coming here after a long week, Thursday night. I'm glad you have something to drink. I'll get there after this talk, my beer. All right, so today I'm going to talk about interactive and interpretable machine learning models. This is work before I joined Brain. It's with Julie Shah, Cynthia Rudy, my awesome advisors and committee members, and Elena, Rajiv, and Sami, my colleagues. So, my vision for my research is about harnessing relative strengths of humans and machine learning models. Humans have years of accumulated domain expert knowledge that machine learning models or even data may not have, whereas machine learning models can compute complex things efficiently and precisely. So the goal or overarching theme of my research is to make them work together so that we can help humans to make better decisions. In order to do that, I develop machine learning methods that are inspired by how humans think that can make sense to humans. This might be about making sense about the data distribution or data set itself, or it could be about machine learning models. Oh, in particular, the work that I'm going to present today, we're going to use examples to make sense to humans. Then we're going to close this feedback loop by building interactive machine learning system to incorporate human experts, domain expert knowledge back to machine learning systems. Particularly, I'm going to talk about how an interactive system that we built for computer science education domain. So before further ado, let's jump right into it. First, I'm going to talk about how we can make sense about data, complex data distribution. This is an area called exploratory data analysis. This is just a fancy way of saying we're trying to understand the data before building any machine learning models. So this first part of my talk is we're going to build no machine learning model. We're just going to look at the data. Particularly, we're going to look at the data through the lens of examples. We're going to use the examples to understand better this complex data distribution. So suppose you just received a set of 1 billion images of newly discovered species. You don't have time to look at every single images, so of course you're gonna, might as well you sample some images from this huge data set. You sampled from this data set, maybe from some big group, and it looks like this species looks like this. It's pretty prototypical representation of the species. Another big group, prototypical examples will show that this animal might be bipedal, walk on 2 feet. But these prototypes don't show you the complete picture. There are all these small groups that you haven't looked at that might give you a better idea about this whole full distribution of this data set. Then the question is, which one of these small groups should we look? We want to look at some important minorities, something that you can't ignore, but you also want to look at something that's different from the prototypes that we already seen. Maybe something like this. This species can be found on computers. Or like these. These species can be found in costumes. So these are important minorities, something that you need to know if you're trying to build a machine learning model to cluster or classify this data set. So at the end of the day, you wish you had a method that would select small set of examples among your data set such that you can understand not only the majority members of this data set, but also minorities, important minorities, so that you can get a full picture and from then on, build a better model. So this work is about an algorithm of that kind. We called it MMD-critic. This is about learning prototypes and also criticisms, so majorities and minorities to help humans to build a better mental model of this complex data distribution. So I just told you, maybe we'll close the door with that. If you guys get hot, let me know. I can hear like kids having so much fun in the swings. So I just told you about, yes?
Sorry, just on that last slide, what's the difference between a prototype and a criticism?
Hopefully we'll get really clear throughout I'll show you the equations. That's probably what Tom might like. If it's still not clear, please let me know. All right, so I just pitched for, okay, we're gonna use examples, right? For image data set, this makes sense. An image might tell more stories than 1,000 words. But is this generally true? What about discrete number data set? What about like hospital record? Does an example still make sense? Well, it turns out that there's a rich cognitive research done on this, trying to understand how humans make complex decisions. And it turns out that humans do what they call exemplar-based reasoning. And in particular, firefighters, when they encounter a new incident, what they do is they think about all the past incidents that they had dealt with, thought about all the solutions they applied back then, and modify that solution to solve this new problem. So I argue that if we're building machine learning models that can be understood by humans, and if that's our goal, we should mirror the way humans think. So we're going to use examples. There's one problem, though. Humans overgeneralize. And as you can see from this cartoon, this is one of the most common cognitive distortions that is widely known. And this cartoon suggests that it might lead to undesired social biases or discrimination. So psychologists looked into this, trying to figure out why this happens all the time. And they discovered that we are designed to do this. We do this to survive or find a better partner. So we are coded to do this, and we can't help it. But algorithms might be able to help. So our work is about, we learn majority the prototypes, but also criticisms by intentionally selecting data points that are underrepresented by the prototypes to minimize overgeneralization. There's work done on selecting good prototypes for either clustering or classification, or just to understand big data. But none of them considered explicitly the minority to represent the full distribution. We have outlier detection methods that focuses on detecting abnormal data points. Again, not focusing on how we can represent the whole data distribution using a small set of examples. So our work is about that. We want to summarize data set using a small set of examples, not only just showing the modes in that data set, but also the minorities or small picks that are also important for you to look at. So here's a sketch of our method. First, we're going to select prototypes from, well, let's say that I'll tell you a story first, and then I will give you the exact equation. So we say we want to generate prototypes, and those prototypes are generated from a particular distribution called P. We want that P to be as closest as possible to distribution Q that generated data. So P and Q, we want them to be similar, right? That makes sense. And then we're going to look at select criticisms such that it would select the areas where P and Q are most different. As you can see, P and Q are never going to be exactly the same. So the criticisms are trying to go to the areas where P and Q most disagree. So I just talked about similar and different. What do I mean by this? We need a measure. We need a distance metric that could measure the differences or similarities between P and Qs and whatnot. Particularly, we use what's called maximum mean discrepancy. This is the definition of MMD is the following. Not my work, someone else's work. It's a measure of differences between two distributions. So think about if you're familiar with KL divergence. KL divergence is also a kind of distance metric, and MMD is another kind. This is a definition of MMD. What it says is if you have we're going to learn a function f such that these two distribution P and Q are most different. That definition should come a little more clear later on, hopefully. An MMD definition says if this function is a particular kind, it's in a particular family, then we have nice analytic solution. It's a closed loop formula that we call Witten's function. So it's a metric that can give you nice analytic function to solve it. That's not it, though. MMD allows you to estimate the distance using just samples. So you never have to write down what P or Qs are going to be. You never have to figure out, well, is it Gaussian, is it something else? You never have to do that. It's just sample-based. Thanks to this convenience, it's been used in various applications using Bayesian model criticism, including Bayesian model criticism and two-sample tests. So that's what we're going to use. In high level, we're going to do the following. The user gives us number of prototypes and criticisms they would like to get. And then we first select prototypes. After that, using greedy method. And then we select criticism given those prototypes. Why greedy? Because we can prove that these functions that we're optimizing are submodular. Who's familiar with the idea of submodular? Right. Who's familiar with convex functions? Great. So you can think of this as like a convex function for discrete case. It's not really. It's convex and concave at the same time, in mathematically speaking. But what submodular function gives you is that the simplest, dumbest possible optimization method will give you pretty good guarantee to the optimal solution. To be exact, it's 63% of the optimal solution. It will get you that close to the optimal solution if you just use greedy method. So that's the submodular.
Here is submodular?
The function that I haven't showed you, but the function that I am optimizing to select prototypes and criticisms. And that's coming up in the next slide. So now I'm going to show you the function. Hopefully this would clear up what the differences between prototypes and criticisms. So we're going to select prototypes from one of our data points. Data points here are red axes. We're going to select prototypes, which are marked as green circle. We want them to be one of our data points. We don't want it to be some phantom new data point that we've made up. It's one of them. Again, we want the distribution that generated these prototypes to be as close as possible to the distribution that generated the data. So we minimize MMD, or we maximize minus square of MMD. Yeah, that's how we run the prototypes. And once we have prototypes, now given them, we're going to learn criticisms. How? We are again going to select criticisms from data points. So we're going to select blue triangles from one of the axes, as long as they're not already selected as the prototype, the green circles. In high level, what we want the criticisms to be is the points where this P and Q are most different, right? How do we know? Well, let's say this is P that we just selected. These are two prototypes that are generated by distribution P. Data is generated by distribution Q. Let's say the data points under this green shaded area are well represented by this prototype that we just learned. These data points in blue axes are not well represented by the prototype we selected. Now, because we are using this nice metric MMD, these shows up naturally as peaks in the witness function. So that's all we need to do. We need to find the peaks in the witness function. So that's what we do. And this whole thing is still submodular. Now, that's not all, though. We want the criticisms to be different from each other, right? Because the whole point is that you don't have to look at the whole data set. You can only look at a couple to get a full idea. So you don't want to show something similar, redundant. So we add this term, which is known to encourage diversity, and the whole thing still submodular. Any questions? Well, I guess we'll leave it. Okay. Now I'm going to show you some results. Showing something is interpretable is difficult because I not only have to convince you that qualitatively, when you look at it, it makes sense, but also quantitatively, I need to give you some numbers, right? It's for the generalization. So that's what we do here. So first, quantitative results. Remember this method, we didn't build any machine learning model, right? This model, this algorithm does not know labels. We just want the prototypes to be good representatives of the data distribution. But if they're good representatives, then if we use them as a prototype-based classification, the nearest neighbor, then it should also work well. So that's what we do here. Here we only evaluate the prototypes and not the criticisms. We compare that to another method that is built for classification. An interesting area is here, the red rectangle, where we have small number of prototypes. Because the whole point, the promise of this method is that you don't have to look at the whole thing, you can only look at small set. For this region, we show that our method is comparable to this another method that is built for the purpose of classification. So that's encouraging. But how do they look? The second evaluation is a qualitative evaluation. This is, we ran the MMD-critic on USPS digits data set. And again, the method doesn't know the labels. But it naturally learns different number of prototypes for each digit. So here we have 6 prototypes for digit 0, 3 for digit 2. These are some criticisms it learned. Some are unrecognizable, not sure. Maybe it's 0, I'm not sure. Some are unusually thin lines and unusually thick lines. So that makes sense to us. We also throw it to an ImageNet. We use image embeddings from prior work. And these are a particular kind of dog breed. Prototype pictures show the dog's face present up and front. But criticisms show some pictures without the dog's face present up front, or black and white picture. We did this for another dog. Again, prototypes, similar story. Criticisms show that this dog's in costume. Finally, we test and evaluate this method with actual humans. Now, one way to show what you built is interpretable is to ask subjective questions. So I can ask, hey, what do you think about this prototypes and criticisms? A better way, in my view, is to give human a task where we can measure their performance. And this task requires the human to understand what we're trying to explain well. Because then the performance, we can use that as a proxy for how interpretable our method is compared to a benchmark. So that's what we do here. For that experiment, we define interpretability as follows. This is not the only definition of interpretability, but it is operational for this particular experiment, so we go with this one for, on this evaluation. The definition is a method is interpretable if a user can correctly and efficiently predict the method's results. So we give the task, and task was we give a user a new data point, like a dog picture, and then we explain each 4 or 5 different groups using 4 different ways. Sometimes we gave them all images, 200 or 300 images of dogs in group 1, group 2, group 3. Sometimes we give them prototypes only without criticisms. Some other times we give them prototypes and criticisms together. And some other times we give them a small set of randomly selected images that has the same number of images as the condition 3. So 3 and 4 has same number of pictures for humans to review. Let's look at some results. Left, we show the accuracy, how well they did. On the right, how fast they did it. These are numbers per question, so the lower bar is, the better or faster they did. People spend the least amount of time looking at prototypes. That makes sense. There was the least number of pictures to review. Interestingly, people spend similar amount of time looking at prototypes and criticisms, which are often range between 8 to 10 pictures, versus 200 or 300 pictures here. So that's interesting. Also interestingly, people spend more time looking at randomly sampled images, even though these 2 conditions had the exact same number of images. Here's how well they did it. When you compare prototypes only and prototypes and criticisms condition, then you can see the influence of criticisms. People spend more time, but people did better. When you compare randomly sampled set of images to this, it's interesting. People spend, these are same number of images to review. People spend more time looking at it, but they did worse. And finally, when we gave them a whole bunch of pictures, they spent similar amount of time and did worse. And this is almost like a glimpse of overgeneralization. Because what often happens when we gave a whole large number of data points, then humans would look at first couple and very carefully, and then quickly scroll down to the rest. Maybe thinking, oh, I totally got this. But accuracy says that they didn't. This might tell us that they were jumping to conclusion too soon without realizing that they're overgeneralizing. Some open-ended comments include that prototypes and criticisms provide less confusion from trying to discover hidden patterns in a ton of images, more clues indicating what features are important. So far we talked about making sense to humans to data. Now we're going to build a model. We're going to talk about how we can make sense to humans on a machine learning model. Similar to the first part, I'm going to use the examples, but this time we're going to build a clustering method that uses examples to explain to humans. Using examples, the idea of leveraging intuitive power of examples has been studied for a long time. The classical AI technique on using examples is called case-based reasoning. How many people heard of case-based reasoning? Ah, great. Oh, great. So case-based reasoning with oversimplification is similar to what firefighter case that I previously talked about. You have, let's say you have a car, it breaks down all the time, and maybe you fix it all the time. Your car breaks down again, then you look at what the symptoms, the light is on or it's not starting. Then you think about all the previous times it was broken, you apply a modified solution, then a solution to your new problem. But you always need labels, so you need to know many times you must have been pretty experienced with the broken car. So you need labels. This is supervised. Also, if fixing your car requires reading pages and pages of documents, that starts to lose some intuitive power. So it doesn't scale well to complex problems. And also, it's not built to leverage patterns and data. We do have machine learning models that can leverage patterns and data. So this work is about we build a machine learning model that can leverage global patterns and data, and we pursue sparsity so that we can scale to complex problems without labels, so unsupervised clustering method. This method is what we call Bayesian Case Model. This is about leveraging the power of examples and subspaces, important features, to explain machine learning results. This is just a fancy way of saying we have something complicated, we would like to explain it to you, and we're going to use examples. Technically, we combine Bayesian generative model and case-based reasoning, so we call Bayesian Case Model. So I'm going to explain how BCM works using examples. I'm glad that you just ate, because there's a bunch of food pictures. There's one way of clustering these data points into, let's say we want to cluster into 3 clusters. What do you see? Yes. 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 That's one way to cluster this data set. Say Mexican food and crepe and chocolate berry tart dessert-ish. So the BCM is general framework for Bayesian case-based reasoning, where we perform joint inference on explanation, the prototypes and subspaces, but at the same time, the cluster labels. So it's a clustering method that simultaneously learns how to explain each cluster. So what do I mean? Well, so we said she's a taco, but this is Mexican food, right? This time we were lucky to have one word to describe this cluster, very succinct. That never happens in real data set. You never have a name for one cluster. So instead, you can say, well, cluster A is like taco. You've eaten taco, you know what's in it. But important features that makes the taco or makes this bunch of data points in a cluster are these: salsa, sour cream, and avocado. Second cluster is like basic crepe. And important ingredients are flour and egg. The last cluster is like chocolate berry tart. Important ingredients are chocolate and strawberry. So formally, we define prototypes to be quanti-essential observation that best represents the cluster, and subspace to be sets of important features in characterizing clusters. So this is a clustering method that jointly learns these all three things, but I'm going to explain in two parts just for the sake of simplicity. So let me explain how the clustering part works. Who is familiar with admixture model? Who is familiar with latent digital allocation? Great. So LDA uses admixture model, which is a way to model complex data distribution. What is it? Well, it is like this. You have a data point. Instead of giving one label to that data point, you're going to give multiple labels to that data point. So for example, this data, this picture is Mexican-inspired crepe. This ingredients that belongs to cluster A, those will get cluster label A. Ingredients that belongs to crepe, it's going to get cluster label B. So this one data point has a vector of labels. You can also imagine a normalized version of this, where each element represents the distribution of each cluster. And combine that cluster distribution with supervised method. So you use that as your data instead of the raw data, and you train a classifier. That way you can evaluate your clustering method. This is what we do, and this is what also is done in the original LDA paper. And you also have some hyperparameter in the Dirichlet distribution to help you guide how picky your cluster distribution you want it to be. So you want a data point to usually just have one cluster label or everywhere. Some control, not over since it's prior. The second part is learning explanations. We learn two things for explanations, prototypes and subspaces. In the generative story, how many people are familiar with generative models? Right, so LDA is generative model. For a generative model, you have a generative story, how you imagine the data was generated. Of course, it's almost always false. It's not how it's generated, but that helps you to build the cost function basically for you to optimize. So in the generative story, the prototypes are generated from a uniform distribution over the data, all the data points you have. This is simple. But in fact, this is what makes BCM intuitive. Because if you're a doctor and you want to cluster your 10,000 patients that you've seen in the last couple of years, then what I would do is I would cluster them, then select the very patient that you met to explain each cluster. We have subspaces to pursue sparsity and select important features for each cluster. And this subspaces are a binary variable. Together with prototypes, it creates this function G, which looks complicated, but it is not. What this function G says, G is similarity measure. So it says, if I'm a data point and I have a feature that I share with prototype, then I score higher than some other data point that didn't have that feature. So for example, let's say I'm a chocolate berry tart, and you are taco, the prototype, which has sour and avocado and salsa as its subspaces, and you are taco salad. Now, you share salsa and sour cream with taco, right? So you would score higher than chocolate berry tart. And that's what function G says. And of course, you can use different similarity metrics, like this one for any loss function. For the inference, we perform collapse skip sampling. I'm not going to walk you through these equations, but something that is often done for LDA-like models and known to mix pretty well. I'm going to show you results similar to the first time. I'm going to show you some quantitative and also some qualitative results. Some qualitative results. We ran BCM on a recipe data, where a recipe is simply a list of ingredients. So don't think about the instructions of how to cook this dish, just simply a list of ingredients. So for example, this data point is like a soy sauce, chicken, sugar, sesame seeds, rice and oil, and salt. That looks like some Asian chicken dish recipe. When we ran BCM on this recipe data set, we learned a cluster that looks like a pasta cluster, that learned herb and tomato in pasta as its prototype, and learned oil, pasta, pepper, and tomato as its subspaces, the red, bold ingredients. And it also has a cluster, looks like a chili cluster, that learns genetic chili recipe as its prototype, learns beer, chili powder, and tomato as its subspaces. Yeah, is that weird? Yeah. So who thinks that I learned beer is weird? Okay. Your life is about to change. Are you ready for this? So beer is essential in cooking chilies. It makes it so much better. Like Belgian dark ale, really good. It's good with like all the stir fry stuff too. It's amazing how much flavor you can add. So in fact, a lot of chilies, or at least the ones we saw, had beer as an ingredient.
And sorry, quick follow-up. Is it that beer is common in those recipes, or just highly discriminative, that it's uncommon, but it's more uncommon in the rest?
Good question. It's both. So think about LDA, right? And when you're learning topic of a document, you don't want to learn words like the or right? So those are common across the document. You want to pick the words that are distinguishable you from all the other topics, but also commonly occur within the members. So it's exactly what it is.
Is there a notion of XTF? You're like an LDA, I would cut out those top words.
Oh, I see. In this one, I think we might have. No, I don't think we removed any oil and salt kind of thing. We didn't because we had some dessert recipes that didn't have oil or salt as a default. Good question, though. Okay. We also ran BCM on a handwritten digit data set. This is the same USPS data set, also publicly available. And I'm showing you 5 clusters we learned. Prototypes on the first row and the subspaces on the second, 5 cluster A, B, C, D, E. From left to right, I'm showing you the inference step iteration. So you want to see something that doesn't make sense on the left, and as you go to the right, it makes more and more sense. And I zoomed in one of the cluster D, which looks like it's learning digit number 7. The subspace, important features, looks like 7, which makes sense. So, a lot of people ask, well, interpretability is great, but we don't really want to sacrifice the performance for interpretability, well, for some applications. Can we maintain the accuracy? This is our comparison to LDA, which uses the same admixture model to model the underlying data distribution. And the BCM is green, LDA is yellow. We show that we can maintain the performance for 2 different data sets for this data that we tested. We also did some sensitivity analysis. This is to make sure that we have a couple of parameters in our model. As we change the parameter, how much performance does it change? We don't want it to be too sensitive. And we show that it's not for the range of values that we tested. So that's encouraging. Finally, we performed human experiments. Similar, the same story with the first part of this talk. We gave a human a new data point, a specific dish. It's a recipe, same recipe data that we clustered earlier. And we show explanations using sometimes BCM, so it's an actual dish. Some other times LDA. These are the topic, the top words in that topic. That is representative ingredients in that cluster, but not actually a dish. We asked 384 questions to 24 people. And we showed that with BCM, people perform statistically significantly better. So far we talked about how we can make sense to humans. I talked about data, and I talked about how we can build a machine learning model that inherently has that structure in it. Now I'm going to briefly talk about how we can extend this framework to make it interactive and finally close that loop so that human expertise can be incorporated back to machine learning model. Before jumping right into that, I would like to convince you first why we were building interactive machine learning system. So earlier, we agreed that this is a good way to cluster this recipe data set. However, if you're an owner of a restaurant and you want to hire a new pastry chef or dessert chef, then this might be a better way to cluster this data. All the savory food on the left, all the dessert food on the right. So you want to make sure that this chef can cook everything on the right. What I'm arguing is, depending on what you're trying to do, what is optimal for the user could be different. And it's often the case the user doesn't know what optimal solution for them might be. And often interactively finding out what works for them is useful. So we extended the BCM framework to be interactive, IBCM. I'm not going to go in detail how we did it, but we extended it and we ran it through some simple experiment, and the result was encouraging. So we decided, okay, well, let's do something a little more real. So we took IBCM and built an interactive machine learning system for teachers who teach computer science introductory Python course. Education is particularly exciting field because now there's a rise of MOOCs, online education system, where teachers not only have to look at a couple of hundred of students' homework submission and give them good feedback, they might have to look at thousands or more students' homework submissions. And that's a challenging job to understand what students got wrong and give appropriate tailored feedback. So maybe machine learning can help. So what we did is we built this system where humans can interact in two different ways. One is select or unselect subspaces, in this case keywords, and promote or demote prototypes. So I should explain this data set is from years of collection of a course taught at MIT during IIP, the introductory Python course. So this is one way that and I should also explain that you're looking at three different clusters, cluster 1, cluster 2, cluster 3's prototypes. And when it's clicked, it's blue. When it's clicked, it's showing the members in that cluster on the right. So you're going to see how teacher may interact with this system. Here, teacher goes to inspect the first cluster. It looks like while is important in this cluster, so most of the student wrote while to write a function .product. So teacher keeps going until the teacher finds something interesting. Some student imported a library. And depending on who you're talking to, this is a great idea and a terrible idea. You're trying to do a homework, but you're also trying to not reinvent the wheel. So teacher decided to promote this as a prototype, specify what was interesting, then see all the other students who took a similar approach. This is all real time. And then continue to inspect the last cluster. Zip looks like an important, and some student made sure that the input has the same length. And depending on who you're talking to, this is a great idea and a terrible idea. And undo the zip as a subspace, so it kicked out the zip keyword and looked at other assert people. And this is a great example of, we want to leverage, when you're a teacher in teaching computer science course, you almost have a philosophy of how language should be taught. And by doing this, they're able to explore spectrum of student submissions better so that they can better deliver tailored feedback for them. But we can't stop there. We need some quantitative results. So what we did here is we gave teachers two tools. We gave the tool that you just saw and another interactive tool. that looks exactly the same, but when you click this button, it reclusters everything. So reinitialize the method and reclusters everything. And all the prototypes and subspaces in this case are selected for them. So this is a rerun of multiple BCMs. And then we invited teachers who previously taught the course and told them, you just got this many homework submissions from students. You have an hour to prepare for your recitation. Now write us a discovery list of things that you want to mention in that recitation or the tutorial session. We gave 48 problems for 12 subjects who previously taught the class, and we asked them 15 Likert square questions, 12 of which resulted in statistical significance. They all follow in one of these items. With IBCM, they were more satisfied, and they better explored the full spectrum of student submissions. They better identified important features to expand the discovery list, and important features and prototypes are useful. And some of the comments include, with IBCM, they were able to go in depth. With IBCM, they're able to, it was useful with large data set where brute force would not be practical. So overall, I'll wrap up. We talked about 3 methods. One is we have making sense to humans about the data points. And then we would like to also make sense to humans about a machine learning model that are inherently interpretable. Then I showed you an interactive system in a real world domain. With that, happy to answer any questions.
So this is really exciting to see because I think a lot of times people just view it as a mysterious black box. I'm curious if you've looked into applying a lot of these strategies to either ensemble methods of classical ML techniques or what I still think of as a black box, like neural nets.
Yes, so that's my job now at Brain. I've been looking at a lot. There's a recent workshop paper that I published that I helped out actually on saliency map methods. So what that is you already have a model that you cannot change, and you are using gradients to identify which pixels in this picture were most important in deciding that this picture was a dog. So that's a technical saliency map. Not mine, but I have a method one method that might be able to get you less noisier picture. But that's a starting point. But there's a line of work that I'm doing, none of which are mature enough to talk about. But to give you a couple more reference, the best paper award at ICML is by Peng Wei, who spoke at my workshop, a student of Percy Liang at Stanford. His work is in that domain of you have a black box model, how can you identify which data point were most responsible for this particular misclassification using influencer functions, which is a classical statistics technique. So there's a lot of work coming on in this area.
Okay, cool. And I had just a follow-up question to that as well. What if the model itself is outputting something like embeddings or something more abstract?
Oh, that's a great question. Yeah, there are lots of areas. So yeah, it's a question is about what if you used embedding instead of the raw images, or what if you have audio data that it's a frequency thing. Sort of makes sense when you listen to it, but it itself, the numbers doesn't really make sense compared to a raw image. Yeah, it's a great question. There are lots of work that has to be done in the area of interpretable methods. I gave a tutorial at ICML that sort of goes over to a lot of material that I don't have time to explain right now, but that's one of the areas that we need more work in. So not many work is done in that.
Kind of a follow-up to that, and but maybe it's a little bit more of like an epistemological question about this entire approach, which is like where do you see sort of the limits here, right? Like I can do the recipes, I can do the dogs. I feel like as a reasonably normal person, like normal person. But like if you had like the breast cancer data set, or if you had something that was much more specialist, like I don't think I could really necessarily learn how to do that, but maybe there are methods to like guide me there.
Yeah, do you mean like limitation of this particular method, or just like the trying to interpret?
Yeah, like what are the
all?
boundaries of like interpretable machine learning? Like
Got
where does it?
Yeah, that's a good question. The definition that I talked about in my talk was, if a human can predict what this method would do, then it's interpretable. Now, the downside of that definition, and the reason why it's imperfect, is that for AlphaGo, or something like that exhibits superhuman performance, you can't do that. You can't expect human to understand and predict what it's going to do, right? So I think that's where you're going at, that in that case, trying to get a global understanding of what this model would generally do, like AlphaGo, it's extremely difficult, right? But that's not the end of the world. We have methods that we call local interpretation. So what that means is you are not trying to understand every single thing about this model, or like globally, what's globally true. You're only trying to understand why decisions are made in this way for just one data point. And that's important in a lot of applications like legal or law and approval decisions, or prison sentencing, where judges or other involved parties might be only interested in, why is this person got this many years instead of that many years compared to the other person? That local interpretation is doable even for complex models, in my view. But yeah, limitation, I think, is also something we can better develop sort of like a framework for. We're kind of limited by ourselves. That's
in some ways, sort of the opposite of what I just asked. But like are there try to phrase this like the right way. Like I guess like AlphaGo is like a really good example where a human expert can explain to me why, what was it, move 47 or whatever the thing was, it was so interesting. But even a human expert explaining it to me can only explain it in very vague sort of terms that are like, it feels soft or something, right? It has like, these very, very metaphorical sort of explanations. Like, do you see like are we able to like sort of using CBT or something like that? It feels like it's actually like kind of getting at more. I see the like clusters, like I see the structure in the clusters myself, and so that triggers some sort of, it's essentially a metaphor. I just don't have the language to describe to you why that's a thing. Like you've chosen good examples that are, I think, like verbally describable, but the space of patterns that I can recognize is much larger. Do you think like that's? Do you think there's like ways to tap into that sort of pattern recognition with these approaches, or I don't even know the right word for it really?
Yeah, I think you're getting a really important point, but let me say it back to you so to make sure I understand.
That was completely incoherent. Yes.
No, I get it. I think what you're getting at is that there's when I give you this explanation as an example, depending on who I'm giving it to, you are making different link in your head than someone else, right? So what about that? We can't say something soft like, oh, this area roughly was, in AlphaGo case, this area was a good move, and roughly that area, or hand wave. We can't really do that in some applications. So now maybe your question is, okay, well, there's natural language explanation, and there is some more discrete sort of representation like examples, and how does the spectrum look like? Is that sort of where you're getting at?
Yeah. So I was thinking of it kind of like a lot of these concepts just don't even have, like you're tapping into discriminatory concepts that don't have language associated with them at all. Like you can only really express them in terms of these examples, and I think that's actually a really powerful expression language, right? Because like now you can express concepts that don't have English words to get at. Right.
Yeah. I think. But that being said, examples are not the final and the answer for everything. It's definitely not. And give you an example for when that's not true. So Finale and I had another work where we were working with people at Harvard Medical School who study autism spectrum disorder data. And their goal was to discover something new, because we don't know yet. We don't understand that field very well. And examples were not very useful for them. So like this kid, okay, well, I know everything about this kid, so what, right? So instead what we did is we built a clustering method that would trying to identify features that are different in two pairwise clusters. So we clustered in a way that we can identify features why cluster 1 and 2 are different. And that's useful because from my limited knowledge about autism, there are very different triggers to final diagnosis. There you could have like physical symptoms. You might have a stomach ache that would lead to autism. You might have some psychological symptoms. So having that what was different in each group was useful for them. And that's really, in high level, that's what that's trying to say is whenever I start building an interpretable model for an area, I can't just go and like sit in my desk and think about it and like something would come up to me. That's never the case. I would have an idea and I would really study what the users are trying to get at. And in HCI, this is called user-centric design, that you study the users, hell out of them. Like you just study, follow them, like study, write up, give them tasks, just try to understand what they're trying to get at. Because oftentimes they don't really know what will be optimal for them either. They never had such a thing, right? So of course they don't really know exactly what the thing that they want is. And doing that really enables us to get what might be useful for them. And that being said, we're trying to formalize this area a little better. So Finale and I have a paper on how we can, doing human subject experiments every single time is expensive, right? You need IRV, you may not have resources to hire doctors, for example, it's too expensive. But if you just evaluate it using accuracy and whatnot, it's just not convincing enough, right? This is two examples. And we're trying to find some middle intermediate layer where you can formulate a task that could be generalized across different domains such that we can run these tasks on Turkers or someone for a wider audience. It's a community-wide effort, in my view, and by building this layer, we can learn what I learned from this hospital doctor case can be transferred to some other legal cases. That's our hope going forward.
It seems like in the sort of course of human history that language has played a really key part in accelerating how humans learn together. And so it seems like interpretability and language are like very closely interlinked. Is there a connection between interpretability here and sort of machines teaching each other or interpreting to each other to learn faster?
Yeah, I have two thoughts on that thing. One is I think language is fascinating. It's being able to communicate using these atoms of things is fascinating. However, there's nothing like language that is so ambiguous, right? If I say a word, like I'm from Korea, North Koreans speak the same language as South Koreans, but the same word is so offensive in North Korea, and whereas the same word is a pretty nice thing to say for a person in South Korea. And that's maybe some extreme example, but depending, like I can say a word to you, and you might find you might interpret it in one way, whereas the other person will like, oh, whatever, or maybe some others will be offended. I don't know, right? And I think for that reason, I think
the results are unambiguous, right? Like we started learning much faster when we actually could start sharing knowledge with
right, that's a great point too. Yeah, exactly. And because the tool itself, in my view, it's fascinating, but because the tool itself, we understand so little, I don't know if that will be a good wheel for us to communicate something so important. So there's that. But the second question about the machine talking to each other, yeah, that area I think it's fascinating that the Facebook thing and a lot of other experiments. Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts on that, but I think it's that direction is promising, and having something that is between humans and then you limit the conversation between machines to use these atoms so that human can understand. However, there are risks of overfitting, or perhaps they are using completely different representation than what they actually think. In which case, you're sort of violating the truthfulness to the model. They might be, you can sort of map that space of machine communication to completely different, rotate it completely differently. Still the same thing, completely wrong, but same thing. You can communicate bits and bytes. So there are dangers to that, but I think that direction is fascinating and should be keep moving forward. Question.
So for this, you used the definition of interpretability, which is it's interpretable if a human can correctly and efficiently predict the message results.
Mm-hmm.
In your paper with Finale, it looks like you had a new definition, which was ability to explain or present in understandable terms to humans. Were there like new examples of different like systems or things that would be interpretability that made you make that switch?
I see. The first one is a lot more concrete and operational than the latter. So the latter was to, it's a big umbrella over a lot of different things. And the first one, I think it's, as I mentioned, it's incomplete for the superhuman performance case. So that was the reason for the switch. It wasn't because of some emerging, new pattern. We started from, and that the second umbrella definition is also still incomplete. It's not operational. But I think about operational meaning that you can't get a number out of it, right? But I'm always motivated by sort of the line of work in fairness field, where and causal inference. For decades, they had lots of discussions about, okay, what does the causal mean, right? And perhaps they're still talking about that. But and also fairness, there's a lot of active discussions on like what is it fair until someone sat down and write down a definition that is not perfect, but it's operational, and we can actually take actions onto that. So this is an area that I'm deeply passionate about. This is like a community effort. I think over the years, lots of people are gaining interest, and tutorial at ICML sort of show that like, oh, people are kind of think this is important too. So I'm hoping that in a couple of years' time, somebody would sit down and okay, this is what it means, or not.
So this is somewhat of a follow-on to what Joe was asking about, like weird, ambiguous things, and the question is about whether you think this can be used to sort of learn backwards about people. So my specific example, so I work at Stitch Fix, we think a lot about clothes and style, these very ambiguous things, and it's not really ever clear whether people have the same idea of what edgy clothes are, boho clothes are, right? And so if you had different individuals, right, constructing these boundaries with your interactive approach, can you imagine learning something about people and what they feel is relevant?
Yeah, that's a really interesting idea. Yeah, totally. I think in a way that we do that to some extent. So I'll give you an example how I might do that in this framework, and also other scholar that has been working on that sort of interesting problems. So in this work, I think if you frame the machine learning part, so going back to that diagram that I drew, machine learning human, going back and forth, if you frame the machine learning models to pick up on particular signals, so maybe you have I'm familiar with Stitch Fix, so maybe you have a predefined factors. Is this person hip, or this person likes skirts, or this person likes bright colors? Then you can interact with the humans to pick out those signals, and that falls into active learning, among other things, to do that, and that's totally possible. People also apply this in psychology domain. So Josh Tenenbaum at MIT does this fascinating work on, an example is, they give the participants a video of multiple blocks stacked on the top of each other on a table. And then they tell the participants, I'm going to hit this left or right corner. Where would the blocks fall? So humans have learned somehow this physics, they call it intuitive physics. Before even it happens, people can imagine where the blocks are going to fall. And what they did is they fitted a computational model, like a Bayesian models, and then trying to learn how humans can infer those complicated physical actions. So yeah, those are some of the things. Oh, and also, same note, like Kiri Wagstaff from NASA applies similar approaches in science. So they're trying to discover which element is, this is the AAAI paper, like maybe 4 years ago, trying to discover important elements in some rock from foreign planet, I think. And then they ran PCA first, and of course it doesn't make any sense because it's a linear combination of each things. So she built a different method where things can be learned from this complex thing that sits there, and now we're going to extract some signals from this thing.
So you sort of alluded to some more recent research that you're doing. What is the next big problem that you're working on?
I can say in high level, because I got into trouble once by telling too much detail outside. So the problems that you alluded to earlier, black box models. So you have a model that maybe many engineers has been worked on for decades, and there's no way you can change it, no matter how convincing you are, right? Then, okay, I have this giant monster sitting in front of me, I can't change anything, and perhaps you can't even look at inside of it because privacy issues or something. You can't even look at, get a gradient out of it, right? Then what can you do? And perhaps more importantly, what can you not do? There are some dangers in explanations. Like I think Joe was alluded to. Like if I give you an explanation of something, you might extrapolate, right? Like the overgeneralization is an example of it. Humans great at Dunning-Kruger's effect, right? Like humans are great at what they stick to what they want to believe. So sort of having that psychology side as a part of this whole effort is super important. So yeah, so psychology aspect of it, and also the black box, studying the black box methods. Yeah, I think Joe's gone, so I guess I'm gonna finish. All right. Yeah, thank you guys.